like your background there, Jonathan.
Thank you. Yes, I worked hard on the color.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you. I'm sure we'll have some other people joining us as they do with these things. So thank you everyone for coming to round 2, day 2 of the virtual showcase. Really excited about this. We had a really fantastic first day. It really was. I was speaking with Jonathan after, and we were both really kind of elated with how well everyone represented themselves and all the interesting work and things like that. And that's on all of you. And I won't be surprised if we have another awesome group of presentations today, because I've been working with all of you, and it really is, you guys are a really special group. So I'm looking forward to day 2 of our virtual showcase. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we are on, my apologies, I'm multitasking as I'm speaking here. We are on Treaty 6 territory, or at least I am on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis. We pay our respect to the First Nations and Métis ancestors of this place and reaffirm our relationship to one another. But again, as we meet here in a virtual setting, we have many treaties and nations represented from coast to coast to coast here in Canada and beyond. So I'd like to also acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home. So as we begin today, I'd like to give an opportunity for some of our fellow sort of leaders in the Genie program and guests to also give an introduction before we start our presentation. So I know it's a similar group than yesterday. We do have some new folks, but I'll start things off with Dr. Jonathan Crossan. To you.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Great. So yeah, I'm Jonathan Crossan, Associate Professor at the Center for Sami Studies at UiT, the Arctic University of Norway, USASC's Genie partner institution here on the Norwegian side of Sápmi. And Martin has asked me to briefly introduce the applied research project for anyone not familiar, who's here tonight, not familiar, or perhaps watching on video later. The Genie program inherited the idea of the applied research project from its predecessor, USASC's Masters in Northern Governance and Development. And those developing the program wanted to produce graduates with the skills and knowledge needed to strengthen capacity in Northern communities. But they also wanted to ensure that we didn't wait until students had graduated before we gave something back. And our program relies on those communities to welcome us during field schools, to facilitate research, and a host of other ways. So it's important that we establish a reciprocal relationship, and the ARP is one of the ways that we do so by asking students to contribute to solutions for immediate problems, sometimes small, sometimes very large and structural. Oh, just a second, Zoe, I'm on the phone right now. Thank you, everyone, for your patience. But it also goes beyond the immediate knowledge of the individual reports our students provide. So we help to bridge the gap between academia and the real world. For those, because those two sides often don't listen to each other very well, or sometimes don't. Just a second. Sorry. Yeah, those sides don't always listen to each other very well, and I think that or they don't always properly value what the other has to offer. And through our ARPs, our students get valuable experience.
We went from hearing too much to not hearing anything at all, Jonathan. So much for all those stories of wonderful internet connectivity in Norway. Okay, so you're frozen in a stoic pose. We'll leave it at that. And I'll explain the ARP a little bit later there. I'll turn it to Alistair McFadden. Again, he's our brand spanking new USAS director at JSGS that we're all really excited about. And Alistair, could you say a few words of welcome to the students?
So I had a chance to see some of the presentations that took place the other day, and I've got to tell you what I'm excited about in the ARP program is that it does bridge that gap between the real world and the classroom. But what it also has reflected, at least for me, is that it shows how you've combined your knowledge and what you're learning with your own practical experience and talent and knowledge. These are very much self-directed and guided by the interests of communities, and it's a real thrill to see how you're putting your knowledge to use. So I'm looking forward to today's presentations.
Thank you, Alistair. And we again have Emmy, who all of you know, and I would normally ask her to say a few words of welcome, but I know she has extremely spotty internet, so she sends her welcomes as well. And I've again received a number of regrets from various faculty, both on the UIT side and USAS side. So I just want that, and they're interested in watching the recording. So if it's Curtis, Elsa, Greta, Bruno, and other folks have sent their regrets. So there'll probably be some virtual participation at a later time with these presentations. So I won't go too much into the ARP as I did yesterday, but all this to say for folks that are sort of new to this, really want to reflect that the students in these presentations, to give some context, started in January, and we are here at the end of July, and did these wonderful applied research projects, which in the context of research is lightning speed research. And what they had to do from January to now is really sort of flesh out their research idea, engage with their community partners, have a memorandum of understanding with their community partners, and sort of weave all of this together in something that's meaningful and impactful and hopefully useful for their community partners. So that is a very impressive undertaking to do in a short period of time. Okay, so let's get things going. So first up today, we have Kent Brazclaf, and he is going to talk about some of the really exciting and interesting work that he has done on holistic protection of water. And I will turn it to Kent.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
We hear you great.
Perfect. I'll just share my screen. And you all disappeared. Okay. Can you see it okay? Should be seeing an infographic.
Looks good.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name's Kent Bretzlaff. I'm coming to you from the traditional territory of the Kwalindun First Nation and the Kwachin Council here in Whitehorse, Yukon. I guess a little bit about myself. I grew up in Algonquin territory on both sides of the Ottawa River. That's where I first got connected and I grew my admiration for water, and it's been a pursuit that hasn't stopped since then. After obtaining a degree in water resource engineering in Guelph, I skipped up to Yellowknife, where I spent 3 years analyzing, I guess, northern watersheds across Northwest Territories and Nunavut, mostly in the mining sector. And then after 3 years, jumped over the Mackenzie Mountains, and my partner and I moved here to Whitehorse, which is great. We love it here. I've been here about 3.5 years now. And I am currently employed by the Yukon Water Board, which is the territorial regulator for water use and disposal, as their technical advisor. So the RP has come and almost gone. It's been a great whirlwind. And I've had the awesome opportunity to work with the Carcross-Tagish First Nation, which is just south of Whitehorse, about 45 minutes. The traditional territory spans southern Yukon as well as northern BC, and is comprised of large amount of lakes, rivers, glaciers, a lot of water on traditional territory. So that's kind of was a perfect fit in my mind, and I've really appreciated the opportunity. Carcross-Tagish has not ceded Lodio title of their traditional lands. They are a signatory to a final agreement here in Yukon, or a modern treaty, otherwise known as, and they are currently in negotiations for a modern treaty in BC. So yeah, kind of getting in, just even here a bit. So the big picture of this ARP is that I got to look at Tu and Heen. Tu is Tagish for water, Heen is Tlingit for water, and basically look at the holistic protection of the resource and how it's intrinsically linked to their culture in kind of the gaps that we see in modern legislation that doesn't fully speak to how it is so important to their culture. So in short, Carcross Tagish does not see any legal separation between land and water. It's interconnected. You cannot look at the wellness of land without looking at the water that's adjacent to it, and vice versa. And also culturally, due to having so much valuable water on their traditional territory, it's all of equal importance. I'll get into a bit more, but the current water governance frameworks in Yukon and BC don't promote the worldview to look at water and land in equal context. And due to that, to enable the holistic protection of the Yukon River headwaters, which is the Carcross Tagish traditional territory, is believed that equal recognition within Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution for water is required. So to step back, it's a bit of an exploratory methodology that I undertook. Disclaimer is that what I use to structure my paper is not fully approved by Carcross Tagish, but kind of more of a thought piece and something that could be utilized in the future. And what I'm speaking of is structuring my document using totem pole methodology for policy drafting. So much like in Western understandings, we use headings in documents to kind of lay out an argument with introduction, background, working through it into conclusions and recommendations. Using totem pole methodology, I tried to bridge Western worldview with the worldview of Carcross Tagish to present an argument that is holistic and interconnected, much like a totem pole is. Seen as a living being, everything is connected. You take the time to select the tree with the community. So that's much like how I took the time to look to scope this document with a working group. You take time to design it, much like how we design the methodology of the report, and take time to artistically carve it, which is much like the drafting. So we have the 4 boxes on this document that I am sharing. It's kind of the, for conversation piece, the 4 pieces of the totem pole that I'd like to discuss today. And in totem pole methodology, the base of a totem pole is of most importance, just something to keep in mind. So I'll zoom into the first figure, and the main heading is Tlingit for honor. I will not try to pronounce it because I don't want to butcher it. But basically, the first thing I looked at was the colonial impacts from the small blip of time since contact, and how it's disrupted the Carcross Tagish's governance structures, laws, and culture. So the argument here is to honor Carcross Tagish and change colonial legacies by acknowledging Carcross Tagish's First Nations' inherent right to water in the Canadian Constitution. If we take a step back in time, at the point of contact, Pueblo Bills and colonial direction to the explorers was that wherever Christianity hasn't reached, you can go and explore and settle, basically, using the doctrine of discovery, which is based on terra nullius, or vacant land, keyword in that being land. Fast forward a little bit to the Royal Proclamation. There was acknowledgement of an Aboriginal land title, again, land, and that there had to be recognition and exchange if you were to take title of said land as a settler. So both those things are grounded in land, and if we move forward, the recognition in the Constitution speaks to Aboriginal land title. So land could be acknowledged as encompassing water bodies, but the fact is that there is huge ambiguity to it and has never been clearly defined. So to rectify this, there should be onto territories such as Carcross Tagashes, where there's a vast amount of water, recognition of both land and water in the conversation. So if we go to the next one, the heading is Tlingit for Knowledge. So this one speaks to the incorporation of Carcross Tagish First Nations knowledge and worldview into modern water governance frameworks via collaborative legislation. So this is a summary of kind of two main totem figures within my paper. The first being the current legislation that we're faced with here in Yukon and BC, and the second being the current water governance frameworks that stem from that legislation. So if we're to look at Yukon first, there is within the umbrella final agreement, which is kind of the voice and platform to negotiate the final agreements for First Nation. There is Chapter 14, which speaks to water management. And within both the Waters Act, the Territorial Waters Act, and the final agreements, there is the ability to have representation by federal, territorial, and First Nation representatives at the Yukon Water Board, which is where I work, in decision making, but is quasi-judicial and doesn't provide the avenues for both traditional and Western worldviews. In BC, it's a bit more of a closed door operation where you apply for the water use license. The BC Ministry of Environment deems if there should be consultation or not. If no matter which way that looks at, they grant water licenses or not, and there is an appeal process. That was a very quick summary, but all that to say, it's not open venue for all worldviews and participation, and which is very evident whenever you look at both jurisdictions' water legislation and I think it's the third section in each dictate that the territorial or provincial government owns all water in the jurisdiction. Next up, we look at harmony between culture, spirituality, and the environment by recognizing water as a living soul and legal person. This is kind of the stepping stone to look forward of what we could progress to. I looked at several case studies across the globe that has assigned legal personhood to water, much like think of a corporation that is granted legal personhood and there's a board of directors or a guardianship that speaks on behalf. So there's case studies I pulled from New Zealand, Australia, India, South America, and most recently in Quebec with the Magpie River. This is an avenue that could be explored to provide water with that legal personhood and have more of a solid seat at the table for recognition. And finally, the pillar of this totem methodology and my paper and this conversation today is respect to Carcross Tagage's culture, and that there's belief that water coexists with all aspects of nature, spirituality, and human life. The culture is the base, and their virtue and values at Carcross Tagish make up all their laws, their legislation, their culture. And moving forward, they are drafting their own water declarations and in time water legislation to bring to the table to be able to holistically protect their environment that they hold dear, both land, water, and culture. So by updating current legislations, providing a seat that accepts and acknowledges both worldviews and shared decision making power, as well as providing more legal certainties around water, are all aspects that you can help promote the holistic protection of water on Carcross Tagage's First Nation territory, and in turn promote the sustainability of their culture. So I believe that's around 10 minutes, and that's all I have to share. That was quick. I'm sorry for my pace, but I wanted to share it all. So I'll take any questions at this time.
Thank you very much, Kent. Questions from the group?
Hey, Kent.
Hey, Lars.
Hey, people can hear me today.
Yeah.
I don't know.
We can't see you, but we can hear you. So mysterious, Lars.
I was so here. I could fix that. Oh no, I can't.
You don't have to fix it. Just ask the question.
So Kent, you mentioned Section 35 rights, right?
Mhm.
Which doesn't speak to water, and the definition of Section 35 rights is often done through the courts. Has there been any court cases specifically around the right to water?
Not that I've come across, no. Most of the common or case law and international law that I looked at was to that part about assigning legal personhood and getting rights that way. In Canada, the Magpie River recently, there is a kind of a group of organizations that assign 9 rights to the Magpie River, and that piece is kind of to support bargaining and negotiating with the province of Quebec to legally protect it. So it's kind of the first step of recognizing those constitutional rights of that river. But that is kind of in its fruition in Canada and will be taken to the provincial courts most likely in the time to come. I did look at the international law and especially the timing with UNDRIP being passed in cabinet. It was interesting, very interesting for me because there are quite a few water related parts to UNDRIP. So that's kind of also in the mix.
Yeah, thank you. Emmy asked, I'll get to Emmy's and I'll get to yours, Alistair. Fantastic presentation. Sorry I missed this in and out of service. What were the key lessons you found in the case studies that you thought were good lessons for Yukon?
I think it's interesting in Yukon because the UFA and the final agreements are quite unique and progressive in nature. It does provide some means for First Nation involvement in decision making with respect to water use and disposal through the Yukon Water Board. With that said, it's not supposed to be a static document, and it's also the UFA and its 28 chapters are supposed to be looked at holistically. And I find in Yukon it's very much due to colonial frameworks turned into a solid approach. So like we look at water and then we look at land use planning, we look at fisheries, kind of mixed between the two. So I think and that seems to be the case in BC and most of the jurisdictions in Canada, but looking more so to international examples of giving this legal personhood to water. I think that would give it the bounds and modernize Yukon to be able to have that discussion representing water and its inherent value and protection. And you can't do that without looking at everything together. So it could be a piece moving forward that could kind of bring in the initial understanding of how the UFA was supposed to be interpreted.
Thanks, Kent. Alistair.
Kent, I'm interested in this totem methodology that you've used. So my exposure to a totem approach is usually by way of a parable or an analogy to tell a story, and there's a moral to the story or to the narrative. Can you say a little bit more about the approach that you've used and how you've shared and discussed that with others in the community?
Yeah, definitely. Like I said, it's definitely at its initial stages to the point that it hasn't even been adopted formally. But I have talked to the host and some of its consultants around it, and basically, first of all, like to look at it structurally, you have the components that initially looking at the colonial legacies. I don't like saying least important, but in the conversation, it's the furthest away from culture being the base. And then really, I guess, in my actual deliverable, I speak to the interconnectedness of it more and how you can't have one without the other and everyone influences each. I do tie in, which is something I didn't speak to, the act of understanding a timeline using seasonal round and lunar calendars. So seasonal round is basically the 4 seasons are interconnected, and with water, it's a neat analogy because you have the frozen states and the liquid states of water that you see. and how those tie to the lunar calendar, and how in the Tagish and Tlingit language in the lunar calendar, it speaks to some of the months have reference to water, so freezing, thawing, that type of thing. So I think the initial stab at this for the totem methodology was more structurally, but I did tie in some other aspects to more portray how everything is interconnected, and kind of also speak to water being having living soul, much like a totem does.
Jonathan, is your hand still up?
I was going to ask the same question, and I also wanted to ask, and sorry if I missed this when my Wi-Fi cut out just after my dinner announcement, but can you just talk about your research process and how you've gone about this, unless you did that already, in which case you don't need to repeat.
No, so I was very fortunate, and thanks so much to Tess on the call. She was kind of my main liaison between Carcross Tagish and school. So yeah, basically there was a small working group formed at Carcross Tagish. Tess was on it. They're one consulting researcher who's done her PhD on like water in their traditional territories. And then the ex-chief and signatory to the final agreement as an advisor, as well as a I'm not actually sure her title, but the lead for one of the How We Walk on Land and Water initiatives for the community. So together, as well as the manager of lands and resources, together we came up with a scope. They provided a lot of valuable documentation to gain an understanding of their culture, as well as their current I guess aims and standing with water governance and where they want to go. So I kind of took that, and then largely it was a literature review of WISE practices legally across the globe on water, as well as kind of a legal scan of current legislation in BC and Yukon. I'm lucky being employed by the Yukon Water Board. The Yukon side was quite easy for me. I guess just a disclaimer too, there's definitely separation between my professional work and my studies. There's no involvement with my employers or the board itself on this. And then, yeah, some draft got comments and kind of did that iterative approach.
Awesome.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. We have time for maybe one quick question from the group. Just a bit of a hot pursuit to Alistair and Jonathan. So you've done this approach and I looked at your draft and it's really good. And again, no one's listening to me. It's much more ambitious than I initially set out in the course. So great job on not listening to me. What would you sort of say, like, you know, so you've done this and it's a different way of kind of constructing an argument. What worked? What didn't work? Would you do it again?
I think it's very valuable to, like, as a person of stellar origin, just take a step back, and a scientist and engineer as well. Like, my mind is very in tune of just like ones and zeros and black and white. So I think for me, it was very valuable to take a step back, and by just researching this methodology and alongside with the other aspects and virtues and values of their culture and how that makes their laws and cultural practices. I myself learned a lot to be able to practice practicism and look at different worldviews. And I think using this methodology can help portray that, because ultimately the gap that we see with water governance in BC and Yukon is that there's no available space to present and accept both worldviews. So by structuring papers like this or deliverables, I think it's a very small step in just helping bridge that.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Kent, and thank you for your sort of innovativeness with your approach. It was really you took on an ambitious project, so great job.
Thanks.
We are moving on to our next presenter. Laura Blahy is going to talk about reimagining the future of work in the North, a case study of key sectors in the Yukon territory. So Laura, to you.
All right, thanks, Martin. Just give me a second here. I'm gonna try to share my screen. Okay, can everyone see that?
Looks great.
It's okay. Everyone in the other day kind of scared me from putting it in slideshow mode, which apparently makes some weird things happen. So I'm just gonna leave it like this. Okay, so I'm Laura Blahy. I also just want to acknowledge that I live and work within the traditional territories of the Kwalindon First Nation and the Uconn Council. I'm originally from Manitoba, Scottish on my dad's side, Cree Métis on my mom's side. Living in Whitehorse here for a few years now. Time goes by really fast. And I work at Yukon government. I'm a policy analyst with the Public Service Commission. So just a bit of background on the project. So this is part, like one small part of a bigger project that is being conducted by Nordicity for Yukon University and Yukon Struct. And you don't have to read this. I just pulled this off the Future Skills website, which is who is funding this work. Just as it's kind of a profile on the project. So overall, this is kind of intended to inform the development of future-facing solutions for skills training and mentoring and networking that kind of support economic development in the territory that's resilient and sustainable. So my part within this was a literature review, so kind of like the first step here. With a few parts. So there was the first question, which is kind of what are the key megatrends impacting the future of work in the Yukon? So that was kind of a high level overview, just future of work generally, with using some like data from Yukon Bureau of Stats to kind of identify what's most relevant. And then looking at two sectors of the economy, that's the case study part. So the public sector and the mining sector, which are both very important to Yukon. And so with that, I just want to caveat this, that I do not have all the answers. This was looking at the literature, and part of that is that it's not focused on Yukon, it's not focused on the North. So that's kind of what Nordicity will be working on. They'll be doing quite extensive engagement within the territory to kind of see what's actually happening out there on the ground. So this is just looking at the literature. Just want to make that point clear. There's definitely more to come on this. And I'm gonna, being that this was like kind of high level and looked at a few different things, there's a lot of findings. And I kind of want to just cover, what's most relevant and important, but I will go over a few of the high level themes, just kind of as background. So there are these kind of trends or mega trends that are impacting the future of work. We have demographic change, economies are seeing aging populations, so that affects the size of the workforce. There's fewer people active in the labor force. Demand for services like healthcare, as well as the composition of the labor force. So as people age, the average age is going up, and also people are working longer. So there's changing dynamics there. Climate change impacts work directly as well as indirectly through policies and efforts to advance sustainability, kind of declining sectors, shifting into maybe so-called green jobs. Technological change, that's where a lot of the focus is. So there's a big focus on automation, are we losing jobs to robots? That kind of thing. Increasing inequalities, there's skill bias, technological change, technology is shifting occupations towards higher skills, automating lower skilled occupations. And then one thing that is not really recognized in literature, but was in one report, Canadian focus that I saw, is reconciliation and inclusion, which I think is a big one. It's not really recognized, but it's important for, especially here in Yukon. So I'm not going to focus too much on specific studies, but I just want to touch on Fry and Osborne because this is kind of like the original study that kicked off all of this. Estimate they were kind of the first to look at the impacts of automation on specific occupations within like a specific labor market. So that was the US. They found that 47% of US employment is at risk of automation. So that scared a lot of, caused a lot of discussion, kind of a lot of panic. Since then, things have kind of moved, shifted. You know, there's been some criticisms of their approach that just because an occupation can be automated doesn't mean that it will, as well as shift to a more task-based approach. So occupations are composed of all their tasks, some of which can be automated, some of which cannot. So just like there are very few occupations that can be totally automated. So things have kind of shifted there. And I'll just touch on the Yukon labor market as well for context. So the Yukon labor market is quite tight. Unemployment has been low for the past few years. Even in 2020, it went up a bit with COVID, was at 5.2%, which is still the lowest in Canada. Educational attainment is quite high. It's above the national average for both the Indigenous and the non-Indigenous populations. But there are disparities between the two groups still, both in terms of education. So Indigenous peoples are overrepresented in lower levels of education and underrepresented in high levels, as well as in the labor market outcomes as well. So unemployment rates for Indigenous peoples are a bit higher. There are also a few other unique factors. So as you can see here, a very large share of the economy of the labor force is in public administration. And there are very few large firms aside from in the mining industry. So that's just a little bit of background. I'll get into the kind of the two case studies. So first, looking at mining, there is a lot of focus on technological disruption for the mining industry. Automation and robotics are big ones. So, you know, autonomous hauling systems, technologies that digitally enable the workforce, also analytics and decision support. So algorithms and AI to process data. So it's often seen in the literature as like a way to, you know, counteract some of these challenges that the mining industry is facing. So they're declining productivity, declining reserves that are in more remote locations. So it's kind of seen like as a way to help the industry in the future. And there's kind of a narrative like that this will take people, you know, out of harm's way, improve health and safety, and, you know, jobs will shift, you know, from underground to like urban centers, safer places. But the occupational risks aren't super well understood in terms of who's specifically at risk and whether employment will go up and down, up or down in the end. And then there are concerns around, so it's particular impacts on Indigenous peoples. So mining is often located on or near to the lands of Indigenous peoples. So there's often agreements that involve employment targets and that kind of thing, training programs. So there's a significant effort in the industry to enable Indigenous employment. And the mining sector has become a pretty big employer of Indigenous peoples in Canada. So there are concerns that Indigenous employees are overrepresented in more vulnerable occupations. This was confirmed in recent research by the Mining Industry Human Resource Council and something they reported hearing from stakeholders. Really lucky that there was a recent dissertation by Sheila Rules who she talked to quite a few mining industry stakeholders in Yukon. So there was some really good data there. So overall, the scale of transformation isn't certain. That's definitely true in Yukon. It's generally major firms that kind of lead the charge on this. And in Yukon, they're generally smaller or junior companies. So there's a sense that, you know, change is coming, but it's not certain when or how big that impact will be. There's also a sense that it might help with some labor shortages. It's hard to get, you know, higher skilled or particular skills in Yukon. So a sense that there will be change, but the future right now is uncertain. And then moving on to the public sector. So this was definitely different than the mining sector. So there's definitely potential for disruption, but the drivers are different. So there's, unlike, mining or other industries where it's more the economic benefits, it's seen as a way to help governments, meet some of the challenges they're facing. So budget constraints, changing expectations, more as a way to improve service delivery, and that kind of thing. So there are also unique challenges cited with that. So there's the need to advance the public interest while delivering public value, kind of need to face some of those things that maybe the private sector can just kind of skirt around. Nevertheless, there is definitely potential for automation, particularly in administrative roles, more so than frontline or cognitive roles. And a very common theme in the literature is the automation of activities and then shifting public servants' efforts from more mundane tasks to more high value work, which is seen to have benefits, for engagement and efficiency, that kind of thing. So there's not a lot, the public sector is behind on this in terms of adopting these technologies, but in the past 3 years, there has been a lot come out about challenges and impacts of automation in the public sector. So in the past few years, one of the noted challenges is skills. Public services or sectors not necessarily having the necessary skills to enable an effective rollout of these technologies. And then alongside that, there's other shifts. So, citizens have different expectations these days. There's more of a focus on co-production. There's contracting out of services, privatization. So different roles associated with these changing governance approaches. So, a need for contracting out, you need to have commissioning skills. With co-production, you need to be negotiating and building consensus among stakeholders, that kind of thing. So there's a focus on these changing roles, but not so much on the skills that are associated with that. And it's kind of this was trickier to find this information because it's not like in other industries, what skills do people need in the future. There's no integrated picture. So there's, you need digital skills. There's a focus on digital government, public servants we need to increase the digital literacy, but then there's also these shifting roles, but not a lot of talk about, what skills are needed for that. So that was kind of one of the main findings. And I also just want to add that the Yukon public sector, there are some definite unique aspects that are going to shape how these play out. So one of them is diseconomies of scale. So they're kind of delivering a lot of services to very small populations and distributed populations. So it makes it difficult for the government to, capitalize on new technologies. And another one is that if you don't work for the government yourself, someone in your family probably does, or someone you're very close to, or you work for a company that contracts for government. So, people are very close to the public sector here, which makes it difficult to implement, reforms or any kind of privatization, that kind of thing would be very contested, as well as a general expectations among the Northern residents about consultation, responsiveness, and control, which definitely make it not impossible, but very difficult to implement these kind of public sector reforms. So that, I think I went a bit over time, but I just tried to focus on the most relevant things. And I can't really, because of this kind of looked at a few different things, so I don't really have a nice way to wrap it up. But I'll just leave it at that right now and open it up for questions.
Awesome, thank you, Laura. And this is your topic, and I think I've told you this before, is top of mind at JSGS right now. In terms of Alistair's laughing because we regularly nerd out about competencies and skills and things like that. And this is the stuff we want the Genie program, the MPA program, to serve our students well. And we want our ear to the ground to what is sort of needed in the future. So really sort of great. And this is kind of directly, yeah, impacts and helps us think about some of the things we're doing right now at JSGS. So thank you for that. Questions for Laura? Justin.
Hey, Laura. Really, really interesting. And like in my work, we're sort of adjacent to some of this, given that we work with like large mining firms. But I'm wondering, like, are there any jurisdictions elsewhere that are sort of providing some modeling that, you know, that might be dealing with similar instances, like issues around like that automation piece? I think particularly, like, as you said, there's distinctly different motivations for the public sector versus, say, you know, a mining firm. Just wondering if there's like any reference points that you can point to at this point, or is it kind of isolated?
So there are definitely, so there was a big one in mining for Canada recently that kind of looked at the most vulnerable occupations, but there wasn't. It really depends on you know, how much a company is willing to invest. So the kind of the scale of disruption in terms of specific quantitative estimates probably is a little bit more difficult, as well as because the speed, you know, of adoption would impact how much disruption. So maybe it's over slower periods of time. There would be time for redeployment or people to upskill. That kind of thing. There was, in terms of the public sector, it's definitely more limited for sure. Deloitte has done a bit of work on future of the public sector and made some estimates for UK and US. But for the public sector, it's different because the focus is not on, you know, so much on cutting jobs. I mean, they definitely could do that, but it's more on whether or not it's how it'll play out, I'm not sure, but more of a focus on, you know, freeing people up, you know, saving resources, best value for, you know, public money, that kind of thing. So I don't know if that answers your question, but there are some, definitely some studies, but they look different depending on the sector.
Thank you, Justin and Laura. Alistair.
I'm interested in you talked about the private and the public sector, but if we could just talk about the public sector for a minute. A lot of what you described is about the evolving context of our work. Is it the tools that are changing, or is it the purpose of government that's evolving? I'm curious about what you see that's actually changing.
I'd say it's both. There are changing expectations about what government does, but also how it does it. So engaging with citizens, and also there's tools. So the digital part of that is a big part of that as well. So you know, digital tools being used to facilitate that. You know, social media that has come up a few times. You know, public servants need to have more social media skills now because that's a way to interact with the public. So the short answer I'd say is both.
Okay, thank you, Laura. Oh, I was going to go to the next presenter and Emmy ruined it for me. Thanks, Laura, great presentation. When looking at larger mega trends, do you think Yukon has an advantage considering its highly educated population?
That's a good question. I'd say Yukon is relatively well positioned in terms of where the distribution of the occupations as well. So it's a highly educated population. It's also like an employees market, so people have choices about where they work. So yeah, I'd say Yukon does have a bit of an advantage, but it's also going to be important to ensure that, for future growth, that we have the employees with the skills we need. So I think recruitment and immigration is going to be a big part of that as well. There was also, I just want to mention one kind of study by the OECD that looked at Yukon and Saskatchewan actually. And they suggested that for the future, it was going to be important to kind of build that private sector. On the other hand, there's going to be, probably increasing public sector activity as well as First Nations draw down more responsibilities. So that will be growing as well. But on the whole, yeah, I would generally say Yukon has an advantage and is probably relatively resilient to disruption compared to other jurisdictions.
Great, thank you, Emmy. Thank you, Laura. Fantastic presentation again. It's really gives us a lot of sort of food for thought that I'm sure is relevant for all of the students here, but where to position yourself in the future work. And Laura's gonna have all the answers for us by the time she finishes her thesis. A bit of a 5-step plan for all of your career paths. That's a promise from Laura that I just threw out there. Okay, next we're gonna turn to Hannah, and we're gonna go in a bit of a different direction. She's gonna talk about reconciliation and reclamation, enhancing Indigenous capacity in Northwest Territories reclamation economy. So to you, Hannah.
I'll just wait for Laura to give me the screen. Thank you. Okay, can you see that?
Yeah, looks great.
Let me just fix you guys. Okay, so hi everyone. I'm Hannah Hofer. For those who don't know me, I'm a first-year Genie student here, and I'm located right now in Yellowknife Northwest Territories, which is the traditional territory of the Yellowknife Dene First Nation and North Slave Métis, and it's also located on Chief Dragi's territory. I'm excited to share my presentation today, presented by me on the Reclamation and Reconciliation, Enhancing Indigenous Capacity in the Northwest Territories Reclamation Economy. Sorry, I'm just gonna try and hide you guys more. There we go. Okay. So I had the opportunity to work alongside Détancho Management LP, which is the economic branch of the Yellowknife Dene, to complete a literature review of how they can advance a reconciliation through the mine remediation process. So the purpose of my presentation today is to provide a high-level overview of what I found on how mine remediation can lead to economic reconciliation and more broadly socioeconomic prosperity. So I will first explain and explore the path to mine remediation in 4 parts. So first, we'll identify what the actual opportunity is. Then I'll move into exploring what the current capacity of Détancho and the Yellowknife Dene actually is currently, moving into exploring what is actually needed to develop their capacity to participate. And finally, we'll see how Indigenous inclusion can actually result in greater prosperity. So to begin, we will identify the opportunity. So abandoned mine sites have created much tension and strain amongst residents and land users, as these sites have produced environmental, human, and economic risks and harms. Remediation for these sites is an essential next step to ensuring that the landscape can be reclaimed. However, despite the negative outcomes of abandoned mines, an opportunity does exist. Several mine sites have been identified by Détancho around the Yellowknife area, and for the purpose of my study, it included the Ptarmigan and Tom mine, the Christorium mine, and the Thompson Lundmark mine sites. And without getting into all the weeds, all 3 mine sites have been minimally remediated, and they require varying levels of remediation. These sites have the potential to be local training sites to develop greater capacity for the Yellowknife Dene and Détancho to participate more broadly in the growing remediation economy, and can equally serve as a tool for reconciliation. So Indigenous people across Canada want to be leaders and participants in controlling their economic futures to ensure that there's greater socioeconomic outcomes for their communities and peoples. We've seen, partially because of the TRC's call to actions, and specifically call to action 92, that business is becoming known to be a tool for reconciliation to ensure that Indigenous peoples and communities have greater access to training, resources, and opportunities to develop their businesses on their lands and for their peoples. Mine remediation as its concept could provide Indigenous individuals and communities the opportunity to also have spiritual and cultural healing by being active participants on reclamation sites. Greater participation in remediation activities may duly offer the opportunity for the Yellowknives Dene and Detoncho, as well as other Indigenous groups, to confront previous injustices from the legacy of mining on their lands, but while also encouraging greater socioeconomic benefit and inclusion in the economy moving forward. In the purpose of my report, I focused mainly on the National Aboriginal Economic Development Board's 4 pillars of economic reconciliation. These 4 pillars include capacity building, so training and skills development in people, access to capital, which is funding and wealth generation. Then it also includes procurement, so prioritizing Indigenous businesses and people. And finally, wealth sharing, which is to enhance Indigenous stakes in development. The mine reclamation process has ample opportunity to grow these 4 pillars within Detoncho and the Yellowknives Dene, who are now nearing a favorable occasion to become key participants in the remediation of major mine sites, both around Yellowknife. For example, there's the huge Giant Mine Legacy project, which you may have heard of, as well as across the territory, with several major diamond mines closing in the near future. So it's going to be very imperative to ensure that proper training and skills development occur in order to move ahead and address these 4 key pillars for Indigenous inclusion. But now that we know the opportunity that exists, assessing capacity is very important, and that's the next step. So the recognition of what resources are actually available to Detoncho and the Yellowknives Dene is necessary to increase the socioeconomic benefit of remediation. So knowing what sources are already available allows us to address the gaps and areas for growth. So for Detoncho, employment continues to be an incredibly large driver for creating training opportunities, as they rely heavily on the mining industry for employment, and many Yellowknives Dene members work in the mining sector under Detoncho businesses. Mine reclamation work can include a variety of different skills. So there's things including managing water quality, resloping rock piles, tearing down head frames, covering tailing ponds, and monitoring the land after the structures are all gone. And additionally, there's also camp operations and logistics type work needed on site. So many of these jobs are related to work that's already being done in other parts of the mine cycle, for example, the actual operational stage, which could be translated from existing skills in employees or bolstering these skills in new trainees. Doing so would help sustain employment and employee retention with mine closures. Detoncho has an extensive network of companies, which you can see there's the companies right here. And these companies employ a lot of Yellowknives Dene, and they have a large experience in the mining industry. So building on the current workforce helps to lessen any perceived financial risk in developing training. And Detoncho also has over 800 Northern employees, many of which are Yellowknives Denes, as I've mentioned, and many of these are in mining related positions. So it's very plausible to take these workers and retrain them and transform their skills to work alongside new reconciliation and remediation efforts. So by using existing companies and capacity, for example, Detoncho Construction, their environmental or logistics groups, this can help address capacity issues and serve as an educational tool moving forward. So we've assessed the capacity, but we do recognize that there's needs moving forward if we want to continue on these projects. So moving projects ahead to fully benefit Indigenous workers will require Detoncho to identify areas for growth and development. So the remediation of several abandoned mine sites around Yellowknife that I mentioned earlier could develop new and existing skills in the workforce and increase Indigenous employment and leverage Indigenous-owned businesses to become part of this remediation process. But doing so generally requires a 3-pronged approach. So first, training. It's very important to look at training because it's an imperative part of the cycle, as you can imagine. The abandoned mine sites around Yellowknife could be used as a training location to provide hands-on experience in reclamation. Previous Indigenous participation in contamination remediation elsewhere in Canada has shown that it's effective to providing hands-on training and improving capacity for Indigenous communities and peoples. Here, training could be focused on one specific position of remediation, for example, solely focusing on environmental monitoring, or by mentoring 1 or 2 individuals within several parts of the reclamation process to capture a more holistic framework. But whatever the approach they do decide to take, training programs do need to be developed alongside governments and industry and also training partners to ensure that it not only meets the needs of the students, but the needs of the mines. Second are partnerships. As you can imagine, they are also imperative to developing programming and recruiting interested individuals, and then also keeping the operation running. Partnerships with Deshinta or the Mine Training Society, for example, could be used to develop these training and teaching infrastructures. And further, these training groups already have established roots in the community, so they may help in recruiting further workers to participate in such training activities. Other partnerships to explore are joint venture partnerships. So with people such as the Clecho Investment Corporation, which is another large Indigenous business, or Parsons Construction. Doing so can help create an opportunity to learn and mentor with students and individuals who already have experience in remediation. And third, but certainly not least, is funding. Funding is a very big requirement in order to access training and develop capacity. And funding is really often cited as a major hindrance to Indigenous business development. So we saw that there could be a mix of different types of funding, both federal and territorial, alongside other partnerships that may be accessing funding on their own. So for example, the Federal Indigenous Skills and Employment Training Program, CANOR, has an expression of interest uptake every year. The GNWT has a lot of educational funding, but also looking at Detoncho's own source investment. It's also important to note that the more that a training program is developed and is successful, this can also lead to more and greater funding pools in the future. So we've identified the opportunity and the capacity, and we've begun addressing the needs of the community. So now we're capturing the results of mine reclamation in the economy. So by increasing capacity and Indigenous employability, Indigenous businesses become even greater competitive choices for mine remediation contracts because now they have the available workforce. For example, in the Northwest Territories, territorial contracts often require certain levels of Indigenous employment on projects when signing contracts, which is not really being met to its fullest potential here. This removes a very serious socioeconomic potential for Indigenous businesses, as well as the local employment economy. So by being proactive and training individuals now, Detoncho will continue to thrive and develop stronger business cases for their businesses procuring major contracts related to remediation. Another avenue is wealth sharing. So procuring contracts specifically helps to increase wealth sharing by having greater inclusion of Indigenous people in the resource development economy. Actually closing the gap in Indigenous training and education has an estimated $1 billion increase in income for Indigenous people across all 3 territories. So by increasing capacity to work in the remediation activities, Detoncho and the Yellowknives Dene will increase employment dollars in the community and in the Northwest Territories. But the route to success is not without its own challenges, and so I have provided a few recommendations. So first is to identify gaps. Identifying current workforce capacity gaps that exist in the Yellowknives Dene is necessary to ensure that Detoncho is productive with their training needs and programs in the future. Second is to work with industry. Training in any profession requires participation and cooperation between industry and educators and communities. So industry members are very important because they know exactly what skills and technical abilities are required on sites and can collaborate with Indigenous businesses and communities to inform what kind of training delivery and relevance there is to the local context. And lastly, as you can imagine, is to encourage and empower people. The success of a project will require buy-in from community and the members to be active participants in the mine remediation. So abandoned mine sites, as I've mentioned, have affected the financial and cultural relationship between mining and the Yellowknives Dene. So thoughtful consideration to the past and ongoing wrongdoings in the mine cycle will be very necessary. We've completed the remediation path now. We've gone through all 4 steps, but is it really the end? No, I don't think it is, because the remediation process is short, but it can have lasting effects on peoples and communities if done right. So putting people first will ensure that they are enduring positive effects in the community and bring economic prosperity to Detoncho and the Yellowknives Dene. And that's the end. Thank you. I had to find you guys again. I lost them.
Thank you, Hannah. Very good presentation. Very slick. well practiced. Thank you very much for that. You're the first brave soul to do the full screen slide share. So congratulations on that as well. You're breaking the trend here. Questions for Hannah?
I know I answered it so well in my presentation.
Exactly. Justin.
Yeah, I was very impressed with the whatever the platform you used, Hannah. That's not my question. My question is around like what's and I don't know how much this came up, but like what's the role of you know the territorial government and other governments in sort of the enforceability or say bonding requirements that these mine sites you know previously had? Is there the opportunity to leverage any of those commitments as a bridge for the funding challenges that might be experienced? Just curious if that is a topic that was brought up.
I'm not entirely sure, to be honest. Most abandoned mine sites in the Northwest Territories are under federal, they are owned by the federal government. Though there are some industry partners now on some of the sites even that I've mentioned. For example, there's a new gold mine project that's occurring in the Yellowknife area, and they've bought out these old sites. I don't know, there's usually within procuring those contracts, they do have to have some Indigenous involvement and employment. So that's where I see the funding coming in, but I'm not sure what the complete requirements are for funding.
Alistair.
Hannah, just thinking about the conversation we just had about the future of work, there's an evolving expectation that we do remediation in this country. And you talked about the fact that the federal government has jurisdiction of these abandoned sites, because historically we didn't do a lot with them. The other day, we also talked about benefit sharing agreements. And so based on what you know, if you had a seat at the table in the development of a new benefit sharing agreement, let's say a new mine is being considered, what would you build in that actually contemplates the full cycle right through to remediation?
Oh my. Well, I think it's important to know that Indigenous people need to be included at every aspect. And I think, as I've kind of mentioned previously, procurement is one of those big issues and continues to be a big issue in terms of all business development for Indigenous people. For example, the federal government is starting to develop or has developed an Indigenous procurement strategy that does help bring them to the table at all different aspects of the mine cycle. And the Northwest Territories also, they don't have an Indigenous procurement strategy yet, which is getting them into a lot of trouble when Indigenous groups are trying to be sole contractors, for example, on different types of projects across the North. So if it were me and I were on the table, I would ensure that there is a strategy to ensure that there's the greatest benefit to Indigenous procurement. And a lot of, I think industry generally does a pretty good job at enforcing Indigenous employment in their contracting and IBAs and stuff. So I think just continuing to ensure that that occurs, but I think government participation is the biggest step into ensuring that they're continue to be involved throughout the process of the whole mine cycle, whether it be from exploration to remediation. I haven't thought about it very much though. That's a very good question.
Yeah, good answer. Thanks, Hannah. Last question, and then we'll take our body break. But quick answer here. Emmy writes, "Excellent, Hannah. How did you work with community? How did you work with the community during this project? And what are the next steps for the recommendations and project? Also, love the smooth presentation layout. You have consensus. It was a slick presentation.
Use Canva for your presentations, I should say. Sorry, I kind of forgot part of that question.
Next steps.
But next steps, it will be up to Dayton-Cho to work alongside the YKDFN to develop what they need for training. That was not really, I didn't work directly with community to make my recommendations. It's all based off of literature and previously done work. So next steps would just be discovering what they need within their actual population for work, and what work also needs to be done on some of these mine sites. There's not a lot of publicly available information, unfortunately, of where these mine sites are in terms of their remediation, other that they need it done. So that will help inform their next steps with developing training.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Hannah. Really fantastic presentation. Great answers. Again, great job all around. Kent, Laura, Hannah, really great. We're going to take our body break so you can stretch, do yoga, have coffee, meditate, whatever you need to do to recharge those brain cells. And we're going to meet back here, we'll say at 11:16. And Justin and Jillian are going to take us home with this virtual showcase. So I'm going to stop the recording right now, and I'll see all of you in about 5 minutes.
And isolated. Oh, I thought I was going to get away with that. That's a shame. So as I say, over the last year, I've been in our social investment sector. And so the concept here, or kind of started thinking about, well, what practices exist, or what's sort of the best ways of taking these kind of diverse data sets and integrating them into sort of a single umbrella. And I pitched that to Martin, and he said, once again, that's too broad. So we've tried to do some scoping. So as I kind of walk through it, I'll hopefully try and establish kind of where I cut things off for the purpose of this report, which is essentially sort of a knowledge synthesis and a bit of a literature review on sort of again some wise practices. So. By way of background, so the KNC, the Tanaka Nation Council, is a collective government body, which is comprised of the elected officials, chief and council, for the 4 Tanaka bands within Canada. And so the map there kind of shows the traditional territory of the Tanaka, extending into Washington, Idaho, Montana, and Alberta. And then there's a dotted line on the inset. I'm not sure how well it shows up, but that's sort of the treaty territory that is under negotiation. So the Tanaka is a non-treaty First Nation. And so the KNC is really at an interesting point in its evolution where there needs to be some shifts in the decision-making processes. As I said, we need these mechanisms to integrate different types of data to inform decision-making because leadership is asking for it. There's a recognition that sort of the KNC and the bands operating separate and distinct from one another, and the sectors operating separate and distinct from one another isn't working. And so again, sort of the question I'm trying to answer is, how can the KNC look at these wise practices to ensure readiness, for the management and integration of various data sets as a foundation for policy building and development. So the biggest thing I think that we want to start with is to establish a baseline for the KNC relative to where they're at when it comes to data management. So that as I was reviewing the literature, I could sort of exclude the stuff that wasn't going to add value and try and thread the needle, I guess, find a common ground between those within the organization who are sort of at the leading edge of our data governance work and those staff members who might have sort of a cursory knowledge but aren't handling it day to day. And so I wanted to share just sort of some principles and then a summary outlook that the nation has when it comes to data. So first and foremost, to establish that the KNC already views data sovereignty as a means of nation rebuilding. So we don't need to cover a lot of ground in terms of the rationale for that. The KNC has an established and robust research ethics committee and protocols for engaging with research institutions and other external parties. Again, this speaks to the past practices of sort of colonial data capture and research. The KNC leads and self-administers the majority of the research relating to its citizens, including its own census. Tanaka citizens, however, are generally fatigued by the volume and frequency of research, both internally and externally. So just something to be mindful of, and that the KNC value data and wherever possible, utilize it as the foundation for decision-making. The last capture here is from a colleague of mine and an elder within the nation, Gwen Phillips, who is really at sort of the forefront of leading this charge for sort of data sovereignty. And I thought it's important to put Gwen's words in here because it provides that context and that environment that we're working within. And so data is a critical resource of the Tanaka governing bodies. It informs the institutions that they empower to carry out the functions of governance. The Tanaka government needs timely access to quality data to plan and target investments, to manage activities and resources, and to account for outcomes. In implementing the rights of Tanaka people, Tanaka governing bodies assert ownership over intellectual culture, language, and peoples, the historic and contemporary Tanaka identity. Working together as the Tanaka Nation, Tanaka governing bodies will assume data governance and information management functions to support their community development and nation rebuilding activities. So that's kind of where the nation's at in terms of sort of setting a baseline. So for the rest of us though, that aren't Gwen, it's, I think, some definitions and some scoping, some further scoping is useful. So when we speak about data management and governance, we're really talking about everything from data capture to the storage of data, to the sharing of data, to who has access to the data. And then all of the policies that ensure that the data that's captured is validated, that it's archived properly, that it's analyzed properly, etc. And so it's really an evolving process as opposed to sort of a specific endpoint at which you can say we're doing data management. Like it's continually evolving. And so the figure here sort of shows this continuum that can exist between a data dependent state and a data sovereign state. And we see there that our indigenous data governance and decolonizing data is sort of interwoven with one another in this, again, sort of process. Within Canada and sort of within the external environment, so looking outside of the KNC, you know, there's a few, I think there's a few principles that sort of speak to where we're at societally. And then there's some, you know, very quickly, there's some initial findings. And so again, those kind of minimum principles that guide data management practices include OCAP principles. So those are principles of ownership, control, access, and possession, which again sort of speak to those different pieces of data governance. And Article 31 of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which sort of spells out again the rights that Indigenous communities and people have to own their own data, to manage their own data and information about themselves in a manner that is to their benefit and not to anyone else's. So I'll touch on this next line a little bit later, but again, just from a context standpoint, like the KNC is already kind of doing some of this work, but in isolated pockets. So, you know, the most acute example is the First Nations Health Authority and Indigenous Services Canada Tripartite Data Quality and Sharing Agreement, which again, I'll touch on a little bit later. But suffice to say that this work and sort of these models of data management through an Indigenous lens, it's already happening within Canada to varying degrees. In looking at the literature and sort of reviewing the practices as they exist, I realized, you know, that we're not actually talking about practices, which I think are sort of more defined in scope and sort of more rigid. And really, we're talking again about processes. And there's three main processes to touch on. The first one is around developing social infrastructure. The second one is around network structures, and the third one is some considerations around Indigenous data. And so I'm going to dive into those now. So social infrastructure is essentially asking the question, are we ready? Are we ready to do this work? The first and foremost thing to say is that a part of that is a recognition that there is going to be the need to address the historical trauma and distrust that exists within research and data capture. You know, traditionally something that was done to, not done with nations, and that's a very strong sentiment for the Tanaka. There's a need to balance data sharing where it might be beneficial with the appropriate protections of the data for anything that might be culturally sensitive. And for the KNC, this is a very important piece to get right, because when we're capturing data, often what we're doing as well is capturing specific data to the individual bands, kind of collecting it under a single umbrella and treating it as data under a single umbrella. And so the need to sort of differentiate and make it a more granular approach through this social infrastructure is really important. And again, this is sort of just another visual illustration of what we're talking about when we talk about, building data and how we can use that data for governance to inform nation rebuilding. And then that in turn, again, will change our processes about how we are governing that data. So the second process that I spoke to a moment ago is around network structures. And so these are more sort of the tangible frameworks that exist that help support the management of data. So again, we have a continuum here for the simplicity of an illustration, where on the far left, we have our data commons, which we can think about as like large open network, open licensing sites where there's a repository of data that can be easily accessed and shared by any number of people. On the far right, we have a data hierarchy, which is going to be a very closed system, tightly controlled access, purpose-built, usually for sort of a single user. In this case, sort of the user would maybe be the KNC in mind. And then in the middle, we have these data partnerships, which we see actually quite a lot of partnerships, maybe between a university and an organization, where there are protocols in place that sort of govern the access. And so again, we kind of have this continuum. And right now, I think a lot of communities, I think a lot of governments would say, well, we fall into different places on different topics. There's some data that's shared quite openly and freely, and there's other data that's quite tightly constrained. The third process that again really shone through in the literature is just particular considerations around Indigenous data. Very often that data could be characterized as traditional knowledge, which has some unique characteristics that we would need to be mindful of. The first one is around sort of the ownership principles, or how Western sort of science approaches ownership of concepts, of theories, of knowledge. And the thing to say here, of course, is that traditional knowledge is belonging to the collective. So that model of ownership is shifted. But at the same time, that information could be quite culturally sensitive. So there's a real balance between again, ensuring the appropriate protections are in place, but not restricting members of the community or members of the nation from being able to access that data that belongs to them by virtue of being, a member of the nation. Traditional knowledge has historically been an oral medium, so it's dynamic, it's evolving, much as as the Tanaka language even has evolved over time. So it's not a fixed piece of data. And so it continually needs to be managed within a context that's evolving as the data is. And then lastly, again, and Kent kind of spoke to this, through painting with a very, very broad brush, but sort of Indigenous worldview, certainly the Tanaka worldview, things are not separate and distinct from one another. So when we're speaking about data, we're talking about broad data that encompasses sort of different data types, especially geographical data, that's often interwoven into stories, into place names, into for the Tanaka Nation, it's the creation story, sort of the genesis of the nation and of the people. And so to try and extract and parse that can be a very slippery slope. And that's really, again, what this bottom point is speaking to, is that there needs to be an articulated decision and a deliberate decision as to whether or not we're going to preserve the data in the context in which it is delivered. So if it is oral, it's going to be recorded as opposed to transcribed and typed out. If it is a geographical place, often there's a story relating to how to get to that place, as opposed to that place existing kind of detached from that story. That's not wholly congruent with how Western science typically manages data. We like to, isolate, we like to place commonalities together, group things together, and free it from some of that context. And so while I think, the former is certainly preferable, it's not without its challenges. Apologies, I know I'm a little bit over time here, but you know, a couple of examples that I think just bring out some interesting possibilities for the future of data management and government. The Exchange for Local Observations and Knowledge of the Arctic, which is a database that I was unfamiliar with, possibly some of you are. What was really interesting to me in sort of spending some time navigating the site and learning about it is just the search functionality is obviously very geared towards traditional knowledge as per the title, because you can sort of search data by type. So stories, audio files, video files, maps. These are all sort of search functionalities within drop-down menus that then can sort of be refined by you know, contemporary versus historical, you know, et cetera. So quite a granular approach to the search functionality. But as I say, you know, heavy on the context. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Library Information and Resource Network, so another massive database as a subunit of the Australian Data Archive, so, you know, similar to a Statistics Canada, if you will. Very, very robust protocols in there that ensure that the access is restricted to, you know, to Aboriginal Torres Strait peoples and their communities, again, for that information and sharing. The Yukon Partnership in Cape Breton in Nova Scotia. So we've got 5 distinct First Nations, all of whom have sort of limited resources, and so they manage their health data through a collective. But what was interesting here is that there's sort of like a third-party oversight body, which has representation from each of the First Nations, as well as the Cape Breton sort of health authority. And that body manages requests that deviate from the established protocols. So again, that concept of evolution and an evolving sort of management structure. And then finally, as I had mentioned previously, so the First Nations Health Authority, Tripartite Data Quality and Sharing Agreement. So the work, and this is work that's being led by my colleague Gwen, is to look at positioning Tanaka indicators of cultural wellness with data markers that are present in the general population sort of statistics gather, so that in effect, we are delegating a certain amount of that data capture to First Nations Health Authority and to the province of BC, and saying, like, here are the things that we want to understand. These are the markers that are important for us. This is how we define wellness. This is how we define sort of being a strong Tanaka citizen. And these are sort of the proxy markers that we would look for. We would like you, province of BC, through your health data, to report out on the trends associated with those, so that we can link them back to our own internal stuff. So again, I think it's fairly innovative work, but I lovingly say that when I talk with Gwen, it's like trying to drink from a fire hose. There's a lot of information coming at you, and she's operating at a very high level, far beyond me. So at the outset, you know, I tried to sort of point to these wise practices, and, you know, are there any conclusions that I can draw? And I think honestly, the question is that it really depends. It depends on the type of data. It depends on building sort of that social infrastructure to guide and answer the questions about how are we sharing, what are we sharing, what protocols are needed. But I do think one of the strong takeaways is that at the end of the day, a focus on project management and good process will ultimately lead to success. So the rigor with which we can engage with citizens and the communities around building that social infrastructure will in turn inform what we need from a network solution, and will inform you know, what subsequent policies and processes we need in place. But the final piece, and again, this speaks to, I think, in particular, the notion of the evolution of traditional knowledge in particular, is that it's not going to be a thing where we can just sort of brush our hands off and say, job done. We need to be constantly evaluating how well these policies and frameworks and networks are serving. Are they delivering the results that we need, and then how do we improve upon them? So thanks everyone, and happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Justin. Another great presentation. I really like how you took a very sort of broad big topic, and you were really sort of concrete about it, at least with the examples, and kind of tried to paint a picture, and very, very sort of impressive, very difficult to do that sort of thing. We have time for one question, perhaps for Justin, just so we can make sure we give enough time for Jillian with the last presentation. Question for Justin.
Stunned silence. I love it.
Alistair?
It's just a simple question.
Okay.
Given what you've seen, given the breadth of the opportunity and how complicated the transformation is, what do you think the next step is?
I think it's an excellent question. I mean, obviously, that is the question, Alistair. You know, I think for the nation, just politically where it is going, and I was careful to not make this recommendation, as I am just a staff person, you know, a bureaucrat within the structure, that at present the appetite is for a very robust Tanaka specific data hierarchy sort of model. Before I think that the nation is at a point right now where we're reaching areas of critical concern where literally the archives are overflowing. Literally every sector's network drives are backed up with citizen engagement files, with you know, particular extractions from the census data. There is definitely an acute need for at least some repository for everything, and I think that's the first piece that will follow before any decisions about how do we integrate the data. I think it's physically like, let's take stock of what we have and let's put some very general parameters around it, just for security at this point.
Fantastic. Thank you, Justin. Really appreciate that. Again, took on a very sort of challenging topic, and you've really tried to wrestle with it. So thank you for that. For our last but not least presenter, we have Jillian, the arm pump from Justin there, presenting on another, we're going in a very sort of different direction, but a very challenging topic on child welfare. She's going to talk about culturally restorative practices in child welfare, and it's something that like she's really passionate about. She has a lot of really fantastic ideas on this, and I'm looking forward to her presentation. So Jillian, to you.
Okay, let me see if I can do this.
Let's continue the trend of full screen. Let's see if we can do this.
Can you see it so far? Oops.
Perfect. Oh,
There we go.
you're perfect before.
Okay.
Perfect again.
Okay, so good morning, everyone. My name is Jillian Senecal. I'm a Swampy Cree woman from Cumberland House in Northeast Saskatchewan on Treaty 5 territory. I am a member of the Opaskwayak Cree Nation in Nepal, Manitoba, and I'm currently living in Turner Lake in Treaty 10 territory and on Birch Narrows Dene Nation. This is my presentation on Opikinawastuin, culturally restorative practices in child welfare. So to begin, I'd like to talk about this word, Opikinawastuin. It is a Cree term which translates to raising our children well, to nurture our children up, to raise them in a healthy way. It's part of an Indigenous kinship value on the view towards family structures. And it's very different towards typical Eurocentric view of family in that we are not limited to just moms, dads, and siblings. In the Indigenous perspective, family means cousins, aunties and uncles who become your second sets of parents, and grannies and grandpas, and even community members. It's important to note here that the most important thing about this Opikinawastuin is that children are revered as the most sacred part of the community. We raise them up in ways that are met with love and respect and in places of a good, healthy place. And prior to any types of formal forms of child welfare systems, Indigenous peoples were raising their children without being told what to do or how to do it. And these were already healthy systems where culture was very strong and languages and connections to the land were very healthy. So I'm not going to spend well, I'm not going to talk about residential school systems or the era, and I don't normally go based on the assumption that everybody knows about these things, but for the sake of time and for my audience, I will just discuss the connection of children who have attended residential school systems and their connection to current child welfare systems today. So residential schools played a key role in why people become involved in the child welfare system. The ugliness that went on in these places, the pain, the hurt, and all of these really ugly things that went on in these schools severely cut Indigenous connection to culture, to land, to language, to family, to community, and it severed those ties to any sense of belonging that we had as Indigenous people. Unfortunately, this led to, broken children growing up to be unhealthy parents because we no longer had those ways of learning how to parent. We learn these things through traditional knowledge of, how to parent, how to love, and how to nurture one another. And this led to what is referred to of the 7 generations of trauma. And unfortunately, we're only in the 2nd, sometimes 3rd generation now. So we still have a very long way to go in terms of healing. Now, current child welfare systems in Canada are separated under 2 authorities. So responsibility to provide child welfare services is divided between federal governments and provincial and territorial governments. Federal governments are First Nations Child and Family Service agencies, which were developed in the 70s, and those are for on-reserve families. Provincial and territorial governments are considered off-reserve, and even if you're a status or a First Nations person living off-reserve, you would fall under the provincial responsibility of Child Family Services. In Saskatchewan, we have 17 agencies of off-reserve, and in the Ministry of Social Services, there are 19 offices throughout the province. So despite these 2 very different perspectives, or these 2 different entities, we fall under the same legislation, which is the Child and Family Services Act, and the same funding formula. And unfortunately, Indigenous or First Nations agencies receive 22% less funding. So we're expected to match the province, but we're already kind of behind in terms of funding. So it's like, how can we, be good enough for the same as everybody else when funding is already working against us? So this doesn't work on a lot of levels, but some of the current or the most common things that I've seen in my work in the child welfare system, and from what I've learned so far, is that there is not enough Indigenous involvement in the development or implementation of any policies and mandates. Even for First Nations agencies, we kind of like adopt what the province is doing in terms of child welfare policies. It may differ in the way it looks, but ultimately it's the same thing. There is a huge lack of cultural competency in frontline workers and people in positions of power who are making these decisions toward children and their family. And in terms of education on the true history of the impact or the effect that residential schools had on people's ability to parent, it's lacking, and it's kind of led to this more generic practice of, what's expected to work in Southern Saskatchewan, Regina, where all these policies are being developed, should work in Northern Saskatchewan, you know what I mean, where resources are already limited and we just don't have enough access to things that are supposed to help us. And again, too, there's a very authoritative practice or approach to child welfare service delivery. And that's kind of, all of this has led to gross overrepresentation of Indigenous children in care. This number here, or this picture here, depicts in 2019, the Ministry of Social Services released information where Indigenous children accounted for 86% of all Indigenous or all children in care. And that number, unfortunately, wouldn't improve. It would only raise by means of, better reporting practices as well. So what I've, in my opinion, in my humble opinion, and what I've researched so far, there's a lot that needs to happen. You know what I mean? Like things just can't slowly progress if we're ever going to get out of this, and if we're going to lower those numbers of Indigenous representation in child welfare. So there needs to be more redress on current legislation. We need to have more Indigenous input, more Indigenous leaders, more Indigenous community people providing their information or their knowledge of how important culture is towards Indigenous people and how this could improve, you know, the numbers of children in care. Again, going back to Opik the view of what family looks like for Indigenous people, you know, like I said, we're not limited to that nuclear family unit. If we broaden our support network, we have that much more to rely on to help us in this situation. And this doesn't just apply to child welfare. This could apply to education and the justice system as well. So more consideration on what is culturally safe for families, you know, having a true understanding of families' Indigenous background, their culture, their procedures, their protocols, what works for them, creating families who are, or working with families who are the experts of their own lives, right? Like allowing them to be at the level of the worker, I guess, who is providing the services for families. And it's really important to understand as a worker your own ethnocentrism and not allowing it to say, this is my idea of what works for parenting and this is what you should follow. That needs to stop, right? Because there are a lot of, for example, there can be workers who are non-Indigenous from the South who have no children, trying to tell people how to raise their children, and that just doesn't work. So some examples of culturally restorative practices, for trauma-informed approaches to child practice. For those of you who don't know, it's trauma-informed procedures or approaches are when you try and understand how trauma has affected a person's ability to parent, their relationships, their lost connections to culture and stuff like that. So these are all will provide a better understanding of how you can better help people within the child welfare system. What I've seen in Birch Narrows, because they don't have a child welfare department in their band, and they kind of fall under Meadow Lake Tribal Council. So what I've seen in the community is a lot of preventative programming rather than focusing on apprehension. So they have things like, you know, parents will take their kids to cooking, and they have like a lot of involvement with the parents interacting with the family and within the community as well. More child and family-centered programs. So these can be things like positive parenting programs that are happening within the community. These are all, you know, Indigenous-led, Indigenous perspectives on parenting, on culture, on the importance of connections to land and practice are all kind of foundations of these programs as well. And we have people from the community who know the language, who know the history, who know the community, who speak the languages, kind of leading these things so that, you know, they better benefit families who may be involved with child welfare or, you know, have a risk of becoming involved with them. So I just want to end. That's kind of what I've wanted to talk about. I mean, there's a lot of things I wanted to talk about, but I think just having that strong connection to culture and a true understanding of how, you know, assimilation and how these processes of assimilation have affected and influence where we as Indigenous people are today. You know, there's a lot of mistrust towards any form of government, not just towards non-Indigenous entities, but even within communities as well. So this is a quote that I really like from Estelle Simard. She wrote a piece on cultural attachment theory in child welfare practice. So to omit the historical trauma and frameworks of practice in the social work profession is a gross injustice for First Nations people. The unacknowledgement of history and its impact on current realities is by definition to continue culturally destructive practices. And that's basically my whole presentation. Tenige, Mercy Cho, and thank you. How do I stop this thing? Okay.
Thank you very much, Jillian, for that wonderful and very important presentation. I really appreciate that. And again, you took on a very challenging issue. So thank you for that. Questions for Jillian?
I'll raise your hand at once.
Jonathan.
I think Justin actually had his hand up first, so go right ahead, Justin.
It might be overly simplistic, Jill. I know when we had chatted sort of informally, COVID was obviously having a real impact, I think, on your ability to sort of connect with the community during your move. But I'm just wondering if you can speak to a little bit like what sort of the pandemic or sort of what impact these like other more acute things, like we're dealing with forest fires right now in BC, and like all of these things just add another layer on top of what are already systems with, as you say, limited funding and resources. Just wondering if you have any observations on that over the past year and a bit.
So like on how COVID has impacted family structures. Okay, so definitely, and this is just something that I've observed and something that I know a little bit from my short time in child welfare. When you take away things like normalcy and like planning, like every day, like schools and people are at home, you know what I mean? When you're having these families that are stuck together, not stuck together, but in home, I think that the stress and the anxiety that has come with COVID has really led to even more cases of investigations and reporting and stuff like that. I don't know specifically with where I'm at right now in Turner Lake, but just from trends that I've known in the child welfare system, like even school breaks, or like say for Christmas break, the following weeks after, we would get a huge spike in investigations and reports. So I feel like this added on with the uncertainty with how COVID has, what it's done to everybody and what it's done to communities, I think like that has increased more involvement with child and family services. And because there's been like a lot of money and funding going towards support around COVID-19, a lot of that, or not enough of that rather, is going towards supporting families through it, so that with a specific goal in mind to kind of mitigate involvement with child and family services. Did that answer your question?
Thank you, Justin. Thank you, Jillian. Jonathan?
I was just going to kind of brag a little bit about another student, Valerie, who's about to submit her thesis next month, I believe. And for her ARP, she worked to develop this kind of info care package for new mothers in maternity wards coming from Indigenous communities, or particularly from one particular Indigenous community. And within like a year, it had already helped prevent more than one child apprehension. And they were kind of like, how to deal with the various levels of social workers that may be trying to intervene in various ways. And I'm just wondering if you could see a place for that at other levels or other ways. I'm not sure. Anyways, something like that could help parents dealing with child and family services workers that don't have that kind of cultural knowledge.
Mm-hmm. So when I was working in child protection here in Nipawin, there was an agency, and I did work there before I went into the ministry. It's a community program where they have staff, and it's called the Oasis Center. It's basically a community program where whenever you're involved with the ministry here, you go to them for support, and they kind of guide you through what's going on, and they're there just kind of like as a support for you throughout the whole process, from investigation to wherever it might lead. And I think those are very useful, but again, funding is a huge thing for stuff like that. And what I think would work, and if that's an issue, is with with community leaders kind of taking that initiative to support their community members. And it's not an uncommon thing for Indigenous communities to kind of pull together, that whole it takes a community to raise a child kind of frame or mindset. And Indigenous people kind of do that. It's them who are, or it's us who are kind of making do with what we've got. And I think accessing, elders and, more community leaders and partners within the community will help kind of guide people who unfortunately become involved with that, because it's a very scary thing to become involved with child family services. I mean, I was on the other end of it, and I was like, even, I had the understanding of like, oh my gosh, like this is something that's very intrusive, and it's sometimes it can be very degrading because like there's not enough, there's a huge lack of understanding and I think empathy from the workers' perspective, I think. So definitely, I feel like something like that would definitely benefit people for sure.
Thank you.
Okay, questions are flooding in. We only have 2 minutes. Tess, quick question for this very challenging topic.
Thanks.
Sounds like you're about to start a rap for us or something.
Yeah.
Are you good? Oh, yeah, Tess is Lars now.
I'm Lars. I'm sorry, the never-ending complicated system we have here. I'll be quick. It's a really broad question, Jillian, and thanks for your presentation. Just wondering from your own experience what the sense you have is from the province's kind of openness to Indigenous worldview in the child and services, child and youth services? For these kind of different ways of doing things?
So, as an Indigenous person and someone who has worked for the province, and this is not just me being biased, this is like just my observation, I feel like the province is like all show type of thing, you know what I mean? Like they have all these great initiatives and they have all these great things they're gonna do, but much like, I don't know, I just think like even provincially speaking, relationships to and the trust towards, if they're actually going to do something, you know what I mean? It's like even in the Child and Family Services manual, they do make reference to the importance of culture, but they don't specifically say how they're going to support that. And I think that there's just too much talking and not enough action. And I feel, and I'm hopeful that with this whole movement that we see in the Indigenous world is, like we're actually starting to take things into, in our own hands and kind of standing up for ourselves. And, with the growing in population of Indigenous, professionals and people within these very formal and typically non-Indigenous perspectives, I think like we'll see kind of a growth of support or more of a push anyways. But I don't really have a good opinion towards that. I don't know if I'm just frustrated because I feel like, for years and years, they've been saying they're going to do all these things, but really they're very small steps towards actually achieving them.
Thank you, Jillian. So we are at time, but I'm happy to stick around a little bit longer. There's another sort of question. We'll sort of quickly wrap things up. So if you have to leave, that's understandable. Of course, we'll talk behind your back after you leave. So that's the risk, but I'm happy to stay a few minutes longer here to kind of finish this discussion and then wrap things up with the virtual showcase. So F. James Fro, reveal yourself, because what is your question?
I'll reveal myself and maybe even turn on my camera. How's that?
There we go.
Thanks. Jillian, I'm joining you from Treaty 4 territory. I'm really privileged to be here and joining you today. I'm a student at Johnson Sarayama, and I'm doing my master's, a thesis-based master's. Anyway, the area of children and families is one that has always been near and dear to my heart. And my question is for you as a social worker, basically, and somebody who works within the system. I really enjoyed your focus on trauma-informed practice. And And I can only imagine, with the recent findings of the mass graves of children at former residential schools, it's raised a lot of feelings in me, anger, sadness, hurt. And all of that is, I don't know anybody that's Indigenous, and I'm Métis, don't look like it, but I don't know anybody that's Indigenous that isn't connected in some way to this trauma. We're first, second generations away from this. And that's my experience. And I presume that's a lot of other people's experience too. So my question to you is, how do you deal with your anger? How do you deal with the trauma as it presents itself to you in this profession? How do you keep yourself whole?
I swear a lot. Just kidding. I don't know. I mean, like I have a lot of friends who are social workers and people who have, I don't know, I have a big family. So I think for myself, kind of when I do get overly, and I'm not a new mom, I just have, I have a 6-month-old at home. So I'm still kind of dealing with those hormones as well. So whenever I hear something new about all these things, it does really affect me. And it does bring up, anger, and kind of it's like, it can create, and what I've seen is that it's creating even more of a divide between First or Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people. You know what I mean? They're saying, well, why don't you just get over it? And from the Indigenous perspective, and as a mother too, it's like, how the hell can we get over something like this? And, if you could for a second put yourself in that place where, imagine if someone come and took your kid and forced them and severely hurt them for not practicing what they want and what they're, used to doing. I get very emotional, but for myself, I think just, talking amongst other like-minded people and really, I don't know. I mean, I have children, and if it's not me who's standing up for Indigenous rights, for the sake of my children and my grandchildren to come, I feel like, it's a very heavy burden, but it's something that a lot of Indigenous people are proud to kind of take that with them, to kind of stand up for what we know is right. And I feel like just kind of relying on my big support network, I have 57 first cousins, so I have lots of siblings as it is, and just relying on that and kind of trusting the process, I guess, doing what I can to be a part of that movement, I think is kind of keeping me going anyway.
Thank you, Jillian, for sharing that. And I really want to get to this sort of last question. So I'm going to lay down the law here and say that this is the last question. So Caitlin asks, my audio isn't working. That's why she has this question in the chat. Do you find too that aftercare once children are back in the community is lacking? Any prevention workers and children family services workers providing any resources to individuals and communities to flourish? She is also very supportive of swearing, and she notes that there's a lack of empathy. It's still extremely present in service providers. So to you, Jillian. So
okay.
It's about prevention.
Yeah. Definitely, because I feel like what I've seen is that even once you initially become involved with child family or with family services, it can continue and can be kind of a reoccurring thing. I've worked with people in the system who've been in care as children themselves, and all of a sudden they have kids and now their kids are in care. So, I mean, it's a very hard process to kind of break away from. And I believe that is a result of the lack of support afterwards. So, I mean, being involved with the system is very traumatic. It's traumatic itself. So that even adds more to like the hurt and what's going on, but on these underlying issues of even why you became involved in family services to begin with. So yeah, I definitely think that there are resources and support lacking after coming out of care or after being involved. And again, I think prevention programs can really help kind of support families through that. I think that's my answer.
Yeah, no, thanks, Jillian. I think I shared with you, my mom was a foster parent, had a gazillion kids. And one of the things she always said for prevention is that we give foster parents all the kinds of support. They actually get a lot of support, but we actually don't use, we don't think that way for parents who perhaps could use a little boost or something like that. So it's, yeah, it's important. But unfortunately, we have to wrap things up. Thank you all for this really wonderful showcase, for all of the fantastic work that all of you have done. You've really brought your sort of best selves into the all the applied research projects, which is really, you know, fantastic. Your entrepreneurial energy, your innovativeness, your ideas, your sort of care and for, you know, communities, and really being kind of practical as well. I think that's a real theme with all the presentations, really thinking how can you advance things in a good way. So, you know, thank you. Just it really, from my perspective, I've learned so much from working with all of you. It's really just been a tremendous treat. You are just a fantastic group of students with a fantastic, a bunch of fantastic ideas and projects. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to turn it to Jonathan to say a few words, and then we'll wrap things up.
Yeah, I would just say all the same things that Martin has. I've been really impressed with all of the presentations that you've made on Wednesday and again today, and I'm confident that all of your hosts will be equally impressed with the research you've done. So thank you all, not just for the hard work on big projects and for the great presentations and information you shared, but really for being great ambassadors for the Genie program and for helping us to build stronger relationships with Northern communities and Indigenous peoples. And so I hope you all both enjoyed the ARP and learned from the experience. And I look forward to learning more about what you've learned either by reading your reports or by discussing it with you as we transition towards your thesis research. So thanks again.
Thanks a lot. So I'll stop recording and I'll linger in case anyone has any questions about the final report that's due next week or things related to that. So thanks again.